I am Dracula. I bid you welcome.
1960 was the year everything changed for the cinema's bogeymen.
We belong dead.
For the previous 3 decades, cinematic horror had been dominated by the output of the Hollywood studio system. Hollywood in the 1930s was the playground of émigré European filmmakers whose artistic sensibilities had been moulded by a rich, old-world tradition of Gothic literature, ghost stories and macabre fairy tales. Many of them had helped create the first classics of horror cinema, particularly the German expressionist masterpiece, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. One of the artistic exiles plying his trade in Los Angeles at this time was James Whale, a former theatre director from Dudley.
We are about to unfold the story of Frankenstein, a man of science who sought to create a man after his own image, without reckoning upon God.
In 1931, Whale was hired by Universal Pictures to direct a film version of Frankenstein, following the spectacular success of the studio's version of Dracula earlier the same year. Frankenstein, and Whale's even better 1935 sequel, The Bride of Frankenstein, helped set the template for the kind of film that would typify horror cinema for the next quarter of a century. The films made by Universal and its imitators were forced to make a strong distinction between good and evil, thanks to a censorious production code that insisted that monsters were vanquished in the final reel and a sense of moral order was restored to the nightmare-infested version of Europe built on Hollywood's backlots. By the turn of the new decade, the horror film had begun to portray a more contemporary view of the eternal struggle between good and evil. But it was a film directed in 1960 by another British-born export to America that would show contemporary audiences that the most terrifying monster of all just might be the unassuming neighbour next door, or even the unremarkable face staring back at them from the mirror.
Good evening. I have some news that will delight you. Murder is not dead. I do not refer to the ones splashed all over the front pages. Those are in such bad taste. I refer to those exquisite murders that have a touch of the bizarre and which take fiendish ingenuity to solve. Those are alive and well. One will be presented for your shivering delight immediately.
A low-budget, self-financed shocker that many in the industry believed would spell the end of one of the great directorial careers of the post-war era, Psycho, directed by the master of suspense, Alfred Hitchcock, was the first truly modern horror film. Adapted from a novel by horror writer Robert Bloch, Psycho was inspired by a true-life American murder case from 1957. When investigators entered Ed Gein's isolated Wisconsin farmhouse in search of a missing local woman, they could scarcely have imagined the depths of depravity they would find there. Gein was a grave robber who used stolen body parts to decorate his house of horrors. He had also used the skin of his victims to create a woman suit, in a perverse attempt to recreate the image of his dead mother. Coming just 3 years after Gein's committal to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane, Psycho became a true cultural phenomenon whose popularity fully justified Hitchcock's faith in the project. The impact of the film, and how truly subversive some of its imagery was for the audiences who saw the film on its original release, is often difficult for modern viewers to appreciate, given how celebrated and imitated Hitchcock's masterpiece has become. Though the brilliance of Psycho's shower scene is justly celebrated, the film's unparalleled ability to shock manifested itself in more subtle ways. Psycho was the first film to show a toilet flushing on screen, an inexplicably disturbing image in 1960, and provided an unsettling glimpse behind the curtain of good taste and decency that protected society from itself. It made horror all too real, all too possible. Hitchcock showed us that true horror came from a disfigured mind concealed behind the blandest of faces. The kind of ordinary, everyday face we might see on any street. Back in England, at roughly the same time as Hitchcock was working on Psycho, another celebrated British director by the name of Michael Powell found himself at the helm of a similarly transgressive horror film. The release of Powell's psychological shocker, Peeping Tom, would bring his career as a respected filmmaker to an ignominious end and have serious repercussions in the years that followed for producers submitting horror films to the increasingly under fire British Board of Film Censors, as the British Board of Film Classification, or BBFC, was called at the time. Michael Powell, along with Hitchcock, is one of the most talented British directors to turn his hand to the horror film. Powell's long-standing partnership with Emmerich Pressburger saw them write, produce and direct a series of classic British films, most notably their 1940s productions A Matter of Life and Death and The Red Shoes. Peeping Tom tells the story of another shy loner. Mark Lewis is a serial killer who murders women while using a portable film camera to record their horrified expressions as they die. The film paints a picture of Britain as a country seething with a repressed sexual desire as it emerged from the austere 1950s into an uncertain future constrained by memories of the past. Peeping Tom became a hugely controversial film when it landed like a bomb in British cinemas in 1960. The critical backlash mounted against the film effectively destroyed Powell's career as a director, a fate that some in the industry had predicted for Alfred Hitchcock during pre-production on Psycho, but one that Hitch was able to avoid thanks in part to Psycho's groundbreaking marketing campaign. Peeping Tom has since gained a cult following and has undergone an astonishing critical re-evaluation since the 1970s. It is now considered one of the greatest horror films ever made and one of the best films in any genre this country has ever produced. The strident negative publicity generated by Peeping Tom presented problems for the British censor, whose office came under increasing pressure to clamp down on horror films. This was the situation confronting Hammer Films in the wake of Peeping Tom's hysterical vilification. Hammer Films, a production company founded in 1934 by music hall comedian William Hines, whose stage name had been Will Hammer, became the big player in British horror film production during the 1960s. So successful was Hammer as a company in this decade that in 1968 it was awarded the prestigious Queen's Award for Industry. Hammer Films had shot to global prominence with their grisly colour remakes of Frankenstein and Dracula in the late 1950s. Dracula in particular had combined horror with the suggestion of sex in a way that was considered shocking for the time. Hammer experimented with many different genre styles during the 1960s. These films included a successful series of psychological thrillers created to capitalise on the worldwide success of Psycho that use Hitchcockian promotional techniques to engage their audience. But the studio's biggest triumphs, both financial and artistic, continued to come from their seemingly inexhaustible output of gothic horror. The company had been trying to get a sequel to Dracula in production for almost 7 years, but were unable to persuade Christopher Lee to reprise his famous role as the eponymous Count. Lee initially feared being typecast in villainous roles, and so resisted Hammer's overtures to don his cape for a second outing. Yet, somewhat paradoxically, Lee continued to work in the horror genre both in England and on the continent. In 1965, Lee at last agreed to return as the vampire Count in Dracula, Prince of Darkness. Dracula, Prince of Darkness was, like its hugely successful predecessor, directed by Hammer's Gothic specialist Terence Fisher and scripted by the prolific Jimmy Sangster. It is easily the best of Hammer's Dracula sequels and pitted the Count against the vampire-hunting monk Father Shandor, who served as a Van Helsing figure in the absence of Peter Cushing. Father Shandor, played with tremendous verve and charisma by Andrew Keir, was such a compelling character that he deserved a spin-off film of his own. Dracula Prince of Darkness was both a critical and commercial success, but relegated Dracula to a supporting role for the majority of the film's running time, much to the annoyance of Christopher Lee. The actor would become increasingly unhappy with the way Hammer treated the Count in subsequent sequels, reducing him to little more than an increasingly nonsensical plot device by the time the series ended in the early 70s, with Dracula AD 1972 and the Satanic Rites of Dracula, Hammer's unsuccessful attempts to update their franchise by unleashing Dracula on modern-day London. Horror film production boomed during this decade, and Hammer's distinctive house style was copied by virtually every filmmaking nation in the world. America had Roger Corman to tap its own rich Gothic vein. Corman put a transatlantic spin on Hammer's formula and enjoyed critical and commercial success with a series of films derived from the work of Edgar Allan Poe. But it was Italy who rightly laid claim to the greatest practitioner of Gothic cinema in the English style. Mario Bava, a humble genius from the golden age of Italian horror, was a director, screenwriter, special effects artist and cinematographer whose 1971 film, Twitch of the Death Nerve, single-handedly set the template for the slasher films of the 1980s. This famous scene was copied almost shot for shot in 1981's Friday the 13th Part 2. Bava's 1960 film, The Mask of Satan, a visually stunning vampire film in the Hammer tradition, starring former rank starlet and 60s horror icon Barbara Steele, was banned in Britain until 1968 because of its violence. Based loosely on Nikolai Gogol's short story V, The Mask of Satan tells of a vampire witch who is put to death by her own brother, only to return 200 years later to exact revenge on her descendants.
She had a place for everything.
Bava's work in the 60s and 70s proved hugely influential. His 1966 film, Kill, Baby Kill, is Bava's masterpiece of Gothic horror. It is known by many names, including Curse of the Dead, Curse of the Living Dead, Don't Walk in the Park, and Operation Fear, the anglicised version of its original Italian title. It was filmed in just 12 days, after Bava made a bet with the producer that he could shoot a feature film in such a short amount of time from a treatment improvised on the spot. With its tale of a vengeful female ghost played out in a masterfully controlled atmosphere of hallucinatory dread, this seminal work proved to be a major influence on the Asian horror boom of the late 90s. This scene, where the hero seems to pursue a vision of himself, is an almost shot-for-shot precursor to a sequence in David Lynch's disturbing final episode of Twin Peaks.
No.
As social changes swept away old orders in every area of society, cinema and horror films in particular began to reflect the increasing violence and sexual permissiveness that seemed to typify this rapidly changing world. In 1968, as war raged in Vietnam and student rebellion fermented in cities around the world, George Romero, a young director of TV commercials working out of Pittsburgh, was able to distill the spirit of the age into the second most radical horror film of the 1960s. Night of the Living Dead, an ultra-low-budget black-and-white zombie film, created the modern concept of the zombie as a reanimated flesh-eating ghoul. Romero's film has since inspired a host of similarly themed apocalyptic zombie films, but the average moviegoer in 1968 would have been wholly unprepared for George Romero's grim vision of a society in terminal social collapse. Romero's controversial decision to cast the black actor Dwayne Jones as the film's nominal hero was a nod to the struggles of the American Civil Rights Movement. as was his depiction of the film's zombie hunters as trigger-happy rednecks bent on the suppression of insurrection at all costs. The film's incredibly downbeat ending and shocking violence signalled the direction horror cinema would take in the next decade and enabled the film to generate millions of dollars in profit at the box office. However, Romero failed to profit directly from the success of Night of the Living Dead because a copyright discrepancy meant that the film quickly entered the public domain, allowing anyone with the means to distribute the picture the freedom to do so without having to pay Romero a penny. Horror films of this period were still largely the province of independent schlockmeisters like Herschel Gordon Lewis, the infamous godfather of gore, who were eager to make a fast buck by exploiting the public's desire to see scenes of shocking sex and violence of a kind that was still anathema to the major studios. Or else they were the products of B-movie specialists like William Castle. Castle was the director of The House on Haunted Hill and many other undistinguished B-pictures. In 1967, he secured the movie rights to Ira Levin's novel Rosemary's Baby before it was even published, hoping to at last get the chance to direct a prestigious A movie. He made a deal with Paramount Pictures but had to settle for producing the film. Rosemary's Baby, with its high production values, literate script and first-rate actors, brought Castle the respectability he craved, and in the process became one of the first horror blockbusters in the modern sense. The man chosen to direct Rosemary's Baby in 1968 was the famed Polish film director Roman Polanski. Polanski had survived the Holocaust as a child in Krakow and is someone who seems to draw the horror of the world naturally into his life. Shortly after completing Rosemary's Baby, Polanski would escape death a second time. While Polanski worked on a new film project in London, his pregnant wife, the actress Sharon Tate, was stabbed to death in their home in Los Angeles, a victim of Charles Manson and his cult of fanatical hippie killers. Polanski's natural affinity for the dark side of life made him the perfect choice to write and direct what would be the last great horror film of the decade. Rosemary's Baby satirizes the late 60s fascination with New Age religions and the occult. It can be read as a straightforward supernatural shocker in which a young woman becomes an unwitting pawn in a satanic conspiracy, or it can be seen as an account of a sensitive woman's struggle with prepartum psychosis, a temporary delusional state associated with pregnancy. No director is more skilled than Polanski at translating extreme mental states to the cinema screen, as his 1965 horror film Repulsion, the story of a woman's descent into paranoid schizophrenia, ably demonstrated. Because Rosemary is the film's sole viewpoint character, and because of Polanski's masterful handling of the material, it is easy to view Rosemary's fate through a lens of madness rather than the occult. But Rosemary is undoubtedly the victim of an extremely controlling husband, and in this respect, Rosemary's Baby tapped into contemporary fears of male control over female reproduction. Rosemary's Baby captures the spiritual uncertainty of the time and poses a question much debated during this period. Is God dead? The film asks, and if so, who will rise to minister to our need for spiritual meaning in a climate of increasing distrust in organised religion? The answer, naturally, is the devil, or in the case of rebellious youth, deranged cult leaders like Charles Manson. If Rosemary's Baby made it seem reasonable to fear the child you were bringing into the world, then Manson confirmed parental paranoia as a new fact of life for horrified parents across the nation as they avidly followed the trial of his dysfunctional family for mass murder.
I think you could teach us. Do you know that much about living, loving?
Yeah, show us.
It's the man with all the answers, right?
If you ask the right questions.
Like Ed Gein before him, Charles Manson and his family would inspire numerous horror films in the savage decade of the 70s and beyond.
I will work
worship him.
I will suffer for him.
I will suffer for him.
I will die for him.
I will die for him.
I will kill for him.
I will kill for him.
What are you characters nuts?
The cinema screen would bleed as never before.